Welcome, students, to week 1 of our spring quarter for the DGL in Transformational Development. I hope you did get a chance to watch the video from and look at the Canvas site in week 0, because there is some information there for you that it's important for you to see. So if you haven't done that, please do it. But this week, we're going to focus on refining our research questions, because the research questions are really your guide throughout the whole project. The research questions direct your research. So we're going to go deeper this quarter with how you design those research questions so that they will work well. So this is a little list of what I'm going to go over with you. But I want to start by quoting a phrase that I really enjoyed from the Bloomberg and Volpe reading, "No immaculate perception." That in qualitative research, we often end up researching inductively, which means that we don't have a hard and fast theory that we're trying to prove or disprove. We are forming our theory as we go, but that doesn't mean that we start in a vacuum. We actually have a number of beliefs, we have a number of ideas, we have a number of half-formed theories as we enter into the work. And it's very important at a minimum to be conscious of all of this and to actually choose it, to not just carry this framework subconsciously or semi-consciously, but to actually choose this framework. So everything that I go over for you today is going to be connected to what are the frameworks that we're carrying that influence our research questions and will ultimately influence, of course, our methodology. But also, how do you choose the framework that you really want to, that you really believe in and that you really want to use? So the first area we're going to talk about is context. So you have to decide on the scope of your research. That's going to be a critical task for this quarter. How big is the canvas that you're working on? How many people are you going to work with? How many kinds of people are you going to work with? So you really need to look at your context, and you need to figure out, given who you are, what are your opportunities and limitations? What are you going to be able to do? So I'm going to go a little deeper with each of these, but right now I'm just doing an overview. Secondly, you need to look at your research paradigms, that there are underlying assumptions that are going to impact your methods. And so we want to look at what some of those research paradigms could be so that you can check where you currently are again and decide where you want to be. So these are the kinds of questions that underlie our research paradigms. What can you know? Now that's not just what can you know ever or what can you know in general. What can you know about this situation? Secondly, how can you know it? How do you know that you know it? Third, what values inform you as you research in this particular situation and topic? And then what are the processes that you're going to use for gaining knowledge? What processes make sense in this context? Then we're going to go a little deeper into what approaches fit your philosophic foundation. And I could just as easily say, in fact, I should say, your spiritual commitments and beliefs, your doctrinal beliefs, your spiritual commitments. And then lastly, the question of theoretical framework. This is often a very confusing area for people, particularly because we don't have a theoretical framework in qualitative research that is similar to the kind of theoretical framework that you may be used to from quantitative research or may have heard of. Secondly, because people often use the phrase theoretical framework to talk about your research paradigms, that they talk about it in relationship to the theory behind a particular method. But we're talking about it a little differently. We're talking about a theoretical framework that you're using for the content of your research. And we're going to talk about how you identify that. So I'm going to try to do all of that in this video. So hang with me. So is the first question you're going to need to ask as you refine your research questions and as you design your methodology is what's doable for you? And I think it's very important to recognize that this is where our program is also a little different than a PhD. That a PhD can take many years to complete. Some people complete their PhD in 5 years, 6 years. Some people take 10 years. A doctorate of global leadership has a timeline, and we are moving you through that timeline. And you actually have to complete. There are certain points when you can take a quarter more, but that's all you can take. So you need to ask the question, what is doable in the timeline that I have to work with? So secondly, as you think about what can you do in a certain time, you need to ask some questions which will help you clarify that. The first one is, what level of access do you have to your research subjects, and for how long? A phrase that's common in the field of community organizing and community development is moving at the speed of trust. You can't move more quickly when you're organizing a community than the speed at which people trust you to move with them. So it's the same thing when you're doing a dissertation. How much access, not only what level of access, how much of a relationship do you have with them, how available are they, how much does their availability fit your schedule, but also how deeply are they going to let you in? How deep is your relationship with them? And what amount of time will it take to deepen that, to build trust with them? What are the activities that you're going to do to build that trust? What time will they take? Then the third question is, what are your particular gifts and skills? Because that will affect how well you are able to carry out your research. Then, lastly, how familiar are you with the particular context and culture you're studying? If you're very familiar, you can go a little faster. If some of the people that you're studying are relatively new to you, you know a little bit about their culture but not much, it's going to take longer. And when you add all these up together, that will help you decide the size of your study. How many people are you going to study, and how many categories of people? Now, I do want to note that there are 3 foci that you will decide as you think about scope. Or you'll decide which of these 3 foci, or which combination of them, you want to use. So are you focusing on individuals? What happens inside individuals? What happens in their lives? Are you focusing on a particular group? What happens not only in each individual that participates, but what happens to the group? Or what happens to the society? So you can see that some of these are obviously much wider than others, and the wider your scope is, the fewer people or the smaller your set is going to be. So I hope that's clear. If it's not, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about it this week. But I do want to start just by giving you that overview. Secondly, let's talk about research paradigms. Research paradigms are assumptions and goals that affect your questions and affect your research design. So let me give you the examples that are laid out in both texts that you read this week. So if you start with a post-positive assumption and goal, that means that you are interested in using the scientific method, that you are interested in documenting measurable results. Now that usually implies quantitative study, because quantitative study obviously includes a larger group of people than qualitative study. Qualitative study goes deeper with fewer people. So if you really want to document results that you can replicate, you need to have a broader pool, right? And you probably need to do a quantitative study. Now, that means, of course, that you think that the most important truth, the most important information to know is objective information. And you think that you can find objective information that will be relevant to your research question about the group of people that you are studying. That's not typical in fact, it's discouraged in the doctrine of global leadership because we actually want to go below the surface. We're not only interested in what we can document and measure, we're interested in the second research paradigm, which is the interpretive research paradigm, which is that we're interested in how people experience and interpret their reality. So for the kind of leadership change that we hope for in ministry and in mission, you have to really understand people on a deeper level than you can understand them when you're just measuring objective information about them. You really have to talk to them, you really have to listen to them, you really have to understand them. So if the information you think is important to know is how people understand their reality, what's going on inside of them. And the phrase that's often used is social construction of reality. Now, as Christians, we do believe that reality exists, that we don't construct it. But our relationship with reality, our relationship with even ultimate truth, is that we're always trying to interpret. We can't escape the interpretive task because we are human and we have limitations. So we are studying, when we have an interpretive research paradigm, we are studying how people construct their reality. And of course, in the process, we hope that they and we are getting as close as possible to absolute reality, but we don't necessarily expect that we can get there. So we're asking a slightly different kind of question. The third research paradigm is referred to as critical. And the critical research paradigm can actually connect with either, it can be combined easily with either of the two paradigms we just talked about, but it comes from a slightly different place. It comes from an assumption that there is oppression in the world, that there is injustice, and that it is omnipresent, that it affects all areas of our lives, that the way that power is used in our world is not the way, as we would say, that God wants it to be used. And so if you have a critical research paradigm, whatever phenomena you are looking at, you are also looking at unjust power relationships that are occurring as part of that phenomena. The action research paradigm is explicit about not only wanting to understand the world, but actually wanting to improve it. Now, the DGL is a leadership doctorate, and that means that we do assume in the DGL that you want to improve the situation that you're studying, not only understand it, that you're understanding it in order to improve it. So on some level, we always use an action paradigm, but our typical doctorate is in two parts. And the first part is observation and analysis, which of course can include and should include interviews, focus groups, but we want to understand what is going on first. And then the second part of the research is how can you as a leader, how can leaders in general improve the situation that you're studying? So there always is some kind of an action element in our paradigm. But traditionally, an action research paradigm not only wants to change the world, improve the world, but also wants to involve the people being studied in the process of change. So you may want to improve the world, but you may not want to involve the people that you're studying to a very high degree in what you're studying, or you may want to involve them from the beginning. You may want to do what's called participatory action research, and that's increasingly popular and increasingly common in our Doctorate of Global Leadership programs. Then another sort of sub-paradigm, because it can be easily combined with others, is the arts, that you can use the arts to get information about people. You can use different forms of art to do that. That means that you really believe that there is important knowledge that comes from both sides of the brain. So how are you going to incorporate both sides of the brain in discovering the information that you're trying to discover? And then the method that mixes one or more of these methods is called pragmatism. So I want to repeat just so that everyone understands it. Some people when they talk about a theoretical framework, they're actually talking about this. They're talking about our research paradigms. They're talking about the assumptions and goals that affect our questions and our methodology. We are not talking about that when we say theoretical framework. But we do think that this question of research paradigms, what is your default paradigm, or how do you automatically approach things, and what paradigm would you like to choose, is a critically important question as you refine your research questions. So the philosophy underneath, or the theology underneath, right, or the doctrine underneath, that part as you design your research, as you refine your research questions and design your research, there are some philosophical assumptions that you bring to the table as a Christian. Now, I'm going to put a few of the ones out there that I carry, but you really need to ask yourself this question. We're not giving you a set of them that you have to follow. We're provoking your reflection. So, we do believe as Christians in the inherent worth of every person. Now, that could impact who you study, that you're not just studying people who are successful by the world's standards or the world think is important. It could affect this other question of how much you include them in the research process, that if you think that everyone's perspective is valuable, you may want to do participatory action research because you think they will really have something to offer. So there are some implications of these philosophical positions. So the second one would be the connections between us all, that we really do believe that everyone is connected, either as children of the same Heavenly Father or even more deeply as part of the body of Christ, members of the body of Christ. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you probably don't only want to focus on individuals in your research. You also might want to include groups, families, communities, because we do believe that the connection between people matters. We also, of course, believe that there is a spiritual dimension to everything. Now, part of what that might make you do is build some humility into your research, because you know that we are not God and we can't know perfectly. So what does it mean to approach your research from a humble perspective? You may want to look at spiritual dynamics, that you don't want to leave spiritual dynamics out, even though you're definitely going to be looking at dynamics that are explained by theories from other disciplines. Missiology is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. So you're going to be looking at psychology or political science or sociology or anthropology, but you're also going to be looking at theology and spirituality. So you really want to include, that needs to be embedded in your core questions, but it also is something that you need to just be attentive to as you do your research. Are you asking the right questions to get at the spiritual dynamics? And then lastly, we are aware of power because we have a God who is powerful and who shares power and who is also very concerned about justice and injustice. So there's going to be some level of critical awareness in all of your studies, I believe, if this is what you believe about God. And this is what I believe about God. So I'm sharing some of the theological and philosophical commitments underneath. But the most important thing, brothers and sisters, is for you to be clear about which philosophies, which theological stances influence your research questions and your methodologies. So now I want to talk a little bit about theoretical framework. When I was doing my doctorate, I was incredibly resistant to this because I said, look, first of all, there isn't a lot of theory that had to do with my question. Not a lot had been written on it, very little. And secondly, I really said, with the population that I'm dealing with, if I don't go in listening with a very open posture, I am going to miss what's going on, because that population has not been well studied. And we really need to approach with anthropological respect. So I said, I really believe that in the aspect of qualitative research that is inductive, that you watch, you experience, you observe, and you see patterns. And therefore, I don't want to start with a theoretical framework. What I didn't understand is that I already was starting with a theoretical framework. That when you do your research, when you do your literature review, you find certain concepts that resonate. You find certain concepts that that seem to explain what you're looking at, that help you explain what you're looking at. And so you want to be aware of that. Not many, not 10 different concepts, 1 to 3 that particularly stand out to you as concepts that may be useful in explaining the phenomena that you're looking at. So I'm going to go into this a little more deeply, and I'm going to give you an example. So theory, and here I am blending several of the definitions of theory in the literature, in the materials you've read this week. So theory is a concept, or several concepts linked, that connect the dots and explain or provide new insight into a phenomena. So if you think of all the characteristics of all the aspects of what you observe, you could think of them as symptoms. A theory is a diagnosis, right? This person has a sore throat, they have a fever, their nose is running, maybe they have COVID. Let's test and see, right? So we have all of these disconnected observations, and what helps us to understand the big picture is a theory. So the picture here is a picture of a youth with HIV, and that's one of the research projects that you'll read about in Volperg and Bloom, I think. I think it's in that one. Might be another one in Ankara. But this woman who was doing this research was trying to understand more about youth who were HIV positive, and her underlying concern, her underlying research question did have an action element that she wanted to understand how social workers could better support them. And this was at a time in history where an HIV positive diagnosis meant that you were going to die. So these were youth who were dying, and she wanted, or dying slowly or very likely to die, and she wanted to understand how they were living with this diagnosis so that they could better serve them. So the theory that she was impacted by when she was reading through all the literature was Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's understanding of the stages of the emotional response or the psychological response to dying. So she has 5 stages. So this woman wanted to see whether these 5 stages in fact were useful in explaining the patterns of the different kinds of experiences that these youth described. So she wanted to see, are they going through these 5 stages? Are they experiencing denial? Are they experiencing bargaining with God? Are they experiencing anger? Because Elisabeth Kubler-Ross actually had this theory about how these stages flow from one into the other, and how you could actually help somebody move through these phases to end up with peace and acceptance. And so she wanted to see whether that theory in fact fit, and whether she could actually add to that theory, whether she could improve that theory, whether she was going to find information in listening to these youth that would help refine the theory itself, or to build on it in some exciting way. So that's an example, right? So there will be a theory that, as you've been studying, that helps to explain the phenomena that you're looking at, that probably intrigues you, and you want to be in dialogue with that theory, and you want to be intentional and conscious about that you are thinking about that theory, and also what field of study it comes from. So whose theory is it? What field of study does it come from? Now, people have greater or lesser in qualitative studies, in qualitative research. Researchers have greater or lesser attachment to the theory that they're in dialogue with. Grounded theory is a research approach that has very little attachment to any theory, any existing theory. It doesn't mean it has no attachment to theory. In fact, what I did ended up being very close to grounded theory, because even though I had some theories that I was in relationship with at the beginning, halfway through, the data led me to a very different theoretical framework than I started with, and that happens quite a bit. So I did something that was very close to grounded theory, which starts with very little attachment. The sort of other end of the spectrum is the story that I was just telling you, that she started with a proposed theory that she was testing. She was still open. She was still doing qualitative research. So she was still really paying attention and seeing what patterns came out. But she came in with this very clear theory that she wanted to work with. So there's a spectrum of how tightly you hold onto the theory, but you need to be in relationship with theory beyond your own thoughts. So part of what makes missiology particularly complicated, and we're doing our best to help you walk through this, is that missiology always involves more than one field. You can't just look at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross theory, because that's only in the field of psychology. And we always have to include the field of theology. So we may have a framework, a theological framework that enters into our theoretical framework, and we may have one from any of the social sciences. So psychology, anthropology, the whole list, right? Lastly, I want to take you back to the spectrum of dissertations that we always have in a DGL, which is that we have people whose dissertations are much closer to what's called a professional dissertation, which means that you don't have to come up with new theory. You just need to synthesize the theory, the best of the theory that you find, and you need to make sure that it works in this particular context. You have to adapt it, and you have to show how it works in this particular context or doesn't. So you're adapting it. Or you may do a dissertation that is much closer to a PhD, which is that you really need to build original theory that is built on, is in dialogue with, is based on existing theory, but goes